The Delhi Sultanate. The History and Legacy of the Medieval Islamic Dynasty in India by Charles River Editors. Introduction. India has been the location of many different empires throughout its long history. The Indus Valley Civilization was home to one of the world's first civilizations, more than 5,000 years ago, which was followed by the Aryan Vedic culture, and then a host of other kingdoms that flourished across the subcontinent. India has also been the birthplace of many religions. The Vedic religion of the Aryans evolved into the Hindu religion, and Buddhism and Jainism were also born in India. By the Middle Ages, India was home to many different religions and ethnic groups, with dozens of languages being spoken, making India less of a single unified country and more of a land of many countries. Despite India's tradition of cultural and political pluralism, several rulers attempted to place the entire subcontinent under the rule of one dynasty or government with a dominant religion. Most of these would-be rulers were far from successful, although a few came close, setting the template for later conquerors. Ashoka, 268 to 232 BC, was the first Indian ruler who nearly unified the subcontinent under his rule, conquering all but the southern tip of India, and subjecting the land to his strict version of Buddhism. Later kings and warlords were far less successful in their attempts to place all, or even most of India under their rule, until an unlikely band of Turkish Muslim slaves rode into the region in the late 12th century. The religion of Islam had entered India centuries earlier through merchants and missionaries, but in the 10th century, warrior bands of Muslims began establishing themselves permanently in what is today Pakistan. From their permanent strongholds, these Muslim warriors of Turkish descent raided northern India, eventually capturing the city of Delhi, establishing what would become the Delhi Sultanate. From 1206 to 1526, the Delhi Sultanate controlled all of northern India, and during its apogee of power, nearly all of the subcontinent, making it one of the most impressive empires, not only in India's long history, but also in the history of Islam. The Delhi Sultanate was comprised of 5 dynasties that expanded their borders, and Islam, at the point of a sword, but also through diplomacy and trade. The Delhi Sultanate became known as a state that welcomed the expertise of foreigners, no matter their religion, and promoted the welfare of its citizens through a host of social programs. Eventually, the Delhi Sultanate grafted ideas and inspiration from India's pre-Islamic past with those of Islam to create a state that was quite unique and powerful. The Delhi Sultans were themselves descended from Turks and brought with them ideas from Persia. Furthermore, as their empire grew, they invited scholars from throughout the Islamic world to their country, and as Muslim scholars, scientists, and administrators from the Near East made their way into India, the Delhi Sultans also incorporated some of the cultural ideas of the native Hindu Indians to create a state that was as unique as any the world had ever seen. Thus, even though the Delhi Sultanate eventually collapsed, it was a gradual decline that took place after more than 300 years and left a lasting impact on the region. The spread of Islam. The death of Prophet Muhammad, the founder of modern Islam, in Medina on June 8, 632, shook his followers to the core. His disciples, dispersed across southern Arabia, Persia, Ethiopia, and parts of the Byzantine Empire, collectively mourned the loss of their guiding star, and, like many other religions, cracks immediately emerged in the bedrock of the Islamic faith following his death. Shortly thereafter, the religion suffered the first great schism, otherwise known as the Sunni-Shia divide. The rival denominations concurred on a few principles. They agreed that Allah sent Muhammad, his final messenger, to the mortal realm to reinvigorate and further propagate the age-old yet neglected theology, which they believed was the true prototypical religion practiced by Adam, Ibrahim, Abraham, Musa, Moses, and other early prophets. Both the Shiites and Sunnis partook in prayer 5 times a day, fasted during Ramadan, performed charitable acts, and dutifully embarked on pilgrimages to Mecca as dictated by the 5 pillars of Islam. Only by dedicating their lives to praising Allah and adhering to His word would they be granted entry through the gates of paradise. After that, however, the 2 branches failed to agree on much of anything else, and given the absence of a supreme authority to clarify canonical laws and settle disputes, the Prophet's followers developed and pursued their own interpretations of the Quran. Initially, the torch was passed on to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, an intimate companion and the father-in-law of Muhammad, through the Prophet's 3rd wife, Aisha. But many of the subjects inherited by Abu Bakr, the first Rashidun Caliph, vehemently protested against the coronation, and the candidate of their choice was 32-year-old Ali ibn Abu Talib, who was Muhammad's blood cousin, the son of his paternal uncle, and the husband of the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. Those in Abu's camp became the Sunnis, who now comprise 85 to 90% of the 1.6 billion Muslims across the world today, predominantly located in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Indonesia. The Shiites, whose loyalties lay with Ali, make up the remaining 10 to 15%, around 154 to 200 million, and are mostly based in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Yemen, Palestine, and Lebanon. The word Shiite was a derivative of the aptly named Shia, or the party of Ali. Ali's adherents argued that the right to reign over the whole Muslim community solely belonged to the direct descendants of Muhammad, and Ali was the Prophet's closest male relative, and thus the true Imam. They believed they were the ones who were qualified to decipher, defend, and uphold Islamic law and Muhammad's hadiths. The term Sunni, on the other hand, stems from the phrase al-Sunnah, meaning people of the tradition. Sunnis favored a more democratic approach. Occupants of the Caliphate's throne were to be determined by vote cast by an electoral council, shura, consisting of top-ranking religious officials across the Islamic Empire. Ancestry alone, they contended, should not determine who was caliph. Instead, experience, profound piety, mastery of the Quran, and robust leadership skills were the necessary merits. From Abu Bakr, the Rashidun Caliphate was turned over to Omar I, Muhammad's father-in-law, via his 4th wife, Hafsa, whose reign was abruptly cut short in 644 when he was slain by a Persian slave. The Prophet's son-in-law, Uthman ibn Affan, husband of his daughters Ruqayya and Kulthum, served as the 3rd caliph until his untimely death in 656, this time prompted by Egyptian rebels. Ali's time came at last, much to the delight of the Shiites, but alas, he too would suffer the same fate. It was the insurgents who unceremoniously handed Ali the caliphate on a platter, and needless to say, his detractors took issue with this transition, with some audibly accusing him of orchestrating Uthman's murder due to the lack of action taken to punish the fallen caliph's killers. Ali's short-lived reign was punctuated by civil wars, most of them waged by Uthman's cousin Muawiyah, then the governor of Syria. To break the stalemate at the Battle of Siffin the following year, a panel of judges was jointly selected to determine the victor. The judges ruled in favor of Muawiyah, who then pronounced himself the true caliph. Ali cried foul, resolutely rejected the verdict, and resumed his rule from his new capital in Kufa, Iraq. In late January 661, 3 Egyptian Karajites, a new separate sect, composed of those who detached themselves from Ali when he consented to the tie-breaking arbitration at Siffin, as judgment belonged to God alone. Led by Abd al-Rahman ibn Muljam, snuck into the great mosque at Kufa. the intruders crept up behind Ali, who was halfway through his Fajr prayer, unsheathed their poison-glazed swords, and swung at the oblivious caliph. Ibn Muljam's accomplices missed, but his blow nicked Ali on the crown of his head, and within 48 hours Ali was dead. Muhammad's grandson Hassan, the oldest male among Ali and Fatima's children, was chosen to fill his father's shoes, taking his place as the fifth Rashidun caliph. As expected, Muawiyah balked at the council's decision and challenged Hassan. 6 months of heated correspondence, internal turbulence within the Rashidun camp, and grueling negotiations later, Hassan agreed to step down on the condition that Muawiyah pledged to leave the appointment of the next caliph to the Shura. Muawiyah established a new dynasty, the Umayyad Caliphate, and reneged on their pact, declaring his son Yazid the heir to his throne. This did not sit well with Hassan and his brother Hussein, who would have been the most promising contenders, and their sentiments were echoed by the Shiites. They had refused to bow before the 3 Rashidun caliphs, and would do the same with the Umayyad kings in Damascus, and later the Abbasids in Baghdad, pledging their allegiance to Ali, Hassan, and Hussein, the first, second, and third Shia imams, instead. Fully aware of the Shiites' insubordination, Muawiyah sought to stamp out the growing threat as soon as possible. Hassan was poisoned to death by one of his wives, Ja'ada bint al-Ashat, at Muawiyah's behest in 670. Hussein was killed by Yazid himself, who was crowned the second Umayyad caliph 10 years later at the Battle of Karbala, Iraq, in 681. The deaths of the 3 imams gave rise to the concepts of martyrdom and Shia-style grieving. Shia Muslims continue to honor Hussein on the anniversary of his death in a yearly ritual known as the Ashura, which sometimes features self-mutilation, self-flagellation, and other modes of religious self-harm. The massacre of the Talib tribe at Karbala left the Shiites prostrate with grief. Of the 72 people who perished from Hussein's party, 20 of them were Talibs, among them Hussein's brothers and his 6-month-old infant, and all of whom were decapitated. Unsurprisingly, the Shiites' animosity toward the Sunni caliphs and officials, along with those of other Islamic persuasions, became further inflamed, and, as evidenced by the day of Ashura, was a traumatic watershed moment for the medieval Shia Muslims. The consequences of the Karbala incident were not lost on Yazid. Sensing retribution on the horizon, the oppression and abuses suffered by the Shiites grew exponentially. Like Muawiyah, who singled out and slaughtered thousands of Talib sympathizers and their families, and seized land, jewels, and other valuable property from dissidents on a regular basis, Yazid finished off several of Hussein's surviving ambassadors, relatives, and companions. The Umayyad army also defiled the mosques in the hallowed cities of Medina and Mecca, butchered hundreds of thousands of Muslims, and raped countless women in these holy metropolises. Inevitably, the steady proliferation of Shia Islam in the following centuries generated more rounds of hostile infighting on a larger scale within the community. This in turn spawned a number of radical factions, including Ismailism, the precursor to the Order of Assassins' Nizari Ismaili faith. Orthodox Shiites paid tribute to 12 imams. The last imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, more famously known as the Hidden Imam, mysteriously vanished in 940. According to the so-called Twelvers, al-Mahdi never died, but was instead instructed by Allah to stash himself away in a cave under a mosque in Samarra, an event referred to as the Occultation. The Messianic deliverer was prophesied to re-emerge at the end of time, whereupon he would reclaim control of the Islamic world and restore justice and peace on earth. The Ismailis, or Seveners, disaffiliated themselves from the Shiites after the death of the 6th Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, in 765. Jafar's 3rd son, Musa al-Qadim, was appointed as the 7th Imam. Not all were content with the council's choice. Some Shiites who would become the Ismailis had been banking on al-Sadiq's eldest son, Ismail, hence their name, and adamantly repudiated al-Qadim's authority. Since the Ismailis' worldview was centered on hardline egalitarianism, they were strongly opposed to the heathen lifestyles shaped by excessive extravagance and debauchery of the Abbasid caliphs. To garner recruits for the grassroots cult and raise awareness for the new movement, obviously outlawed, the Seveners dispatched dais, who were essentially secret missionaries, to various cities and villages near and far. The Ismailis' political pull reached its peak in 909, when Ubaydullah, the Sevener scion of the Muhammad Talib family, founded the Fatimid dynasty, the first Ismaili caliphate. The Fatimid Empire was headquartered in Al-Qahira, now Cairo, which translates to the victorious, and in its prime consisted of territories in Persia, Syria, Sicily, other parts of Western Arabia, and Central Asia. While the Muslims across the Arabian Peninsula engaged in internecine warfare, Islam struck at the Middle East and Africa like a thunderbolt over the coming centuries. And unlike Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism, the other monotheistic religions of the region, it was spread by force of arms as a matter of course. Islam does not accept forced conversion any more than Christianity does, but the concept of jihad, a sacred war for the defense of Islam, became the doctrine even during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. The concept of defense was interpreted in a broad, preemptive sense to allow Muhammad's followers to conquer the Arabian Peninsula and to invade the lands of the Persian and Byzantine empires. Religion was probably not the primary motivation, however. Arabia possessed limited arable land, water, and resources, while the fertile plains of Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia lay temptingly to the north. The peoples they conquered were generally permitted to keep their religion and laws, so long as they paid the dhimmi, the tax imposed on non-Muslims, which was considerably higher than that paid by Muslims. That was the prescription of Quranic law. In practice, most adopted the religion of the conqueror to avoid paying the tax, and for the social and commercial advantages adoption of the state religion conferred. Jihad figures strongly in the history of Islam, and indeed is a continual feature of the struggles of the great Moorish empires that spread across the world. There is a tendency in modern scholarship to emphasize jihad as a spiritual and internal struggle toward perfection, but as the historian David Cook noted, in reading Muslim literature, both contemporary and classical, one can see that the evidence for the primacy of spiritual jihad is negligible. Today it is certain that no Muslim writing in a non-Western language, such as Arabic, Persian, Urdu, would ever make claims that jihad is primarily non-violent or has been superseded by the spiritual jihad. Such claims are made solely by Western scholars, primarily those who study Sufism and or work in interfaith dialogue, and by Muslim apologists who are trying to present Islam in the most innocuous manner possible. As with so many other civilizations, warfare brought material advantages. Islam did not allow the enslavement of Muslims, but it did permit non-Muslims to be enslaved as prizes of war, so the use of slavery, already endemic to pre-Islamic Arabia, became entrenched in Islamic society. Islam also retained polygamy and concubinage from polytheistic Arabic societies, and sexual slavery was common. Slaves were expected to convert to Islam, though strictly speaking they were not supposed to be compelled. Life as a slave for an Arab master was not always oppressive. Talented men might become trusted stewards of their lord's estates, or even government officials. The lot of women was more onerous, as Islamic jurists allowed masters to use their female slaves as they wished. A select few women might become legal wives and enjoy considerable status and privilege. Despite the burdens and indignities imposed on conquered peoples, Islam also brought certain advantages, at least to the Arabs and Muslim converts. All members of the Islamic faith community, the Ummah, were equal before Allah, and all, whether prince or pauper, were bound to observe Allah's law. The highest lord who acted unjustly might be condemned publicly and even deposed, and the meanest of subjects could not be forbidden from appealing to the law of Allah against his sovereign. Islam taught compassion toward the poor and disadvantaged, the essential dignity of every human before Allah, and religious toleration. The Islamic government was based on the concept of al-shura, consultation, and rulers were counseled by jurists to govern with deference and respect to the needs, advice, and opinions of their subjects. Of course, these lofty principles were not always observed, and their dereliction played a significant role in the history of the Moors. Muhammad was considered the earthly head of the Ummah, and when he died, his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, was elected Khalifa, Caliph, successor. The Caliph was not a kind of pope or emperor. He had no power to interpret the law of Allah, only to enforce and protect it. The task of interpreting the law in particular circumstances belonged to the ulema, a kind of college of Islamic jurists who published their judgments as fatwas. A fatwa superseded the decree of the caliph and could even depose a ruler perceived to be defying the ulema. Although the caliphate was initially led by Arabs, the force that bound their empire was not ethnicity, but religion. As Edward Gibbon put it in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, under the last of the Umayyads, the Arabian Empire extended 200 days' journey from east to west, from the confines of Tartary and India to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. We should vainly seek the indissoluble union and easy obedience that pervaded the government of Augustus and the Antonines. But the progress of Islam diffused over this ample space a general resemblance of manners and opinions. The language and laws of the Quran were studied with equal devotion at Samarkand and Seville. The Moor and the Indian embraced as countrymen and brothers in the pilgrimage of Mecca, and the Arabian language was adopted as the popular idiom in all of the provinces to the westward of the Tigris. The Caliphate first invaded Africa in 639. Egypt was rich, fertile, and the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, and after the fall of Alexandria, the Arabs proceeded in 642 to conquer Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, Libya. It was there that the army stopped, despite an eagerness to proceed, for fear of losing control of Egypt. So it was not until 647 that a fresh army attacked the Roman Exarchate of Africa by Zacyna, modern Tunisia, and parts of Mauritania and Numidia. The Byzantine Empire was divided in a religious conflict, and Exarch Gregory had declared independence, not only in support of Christian orthodoxy, but also in light of the emperor's inability to defend North Africa. Gregory died at the Battle of Sufetula, and the Byzantines withdrew to their fortresses before 20,000 Arabs. The invaders were unable to overcome the defenders' strongholds and withdrew from the Exarchate in return for hefty amounts of gold. In 661, Muawiyah of the Umayyad dynasty seized the caliphate from Hassan, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. The new caliph was more interested in extending the rule of Islam into Anatolia and Asia, and it was not until 670 that an Arab army renewed the invasion of Africa. By this time, the Byzantines, severely mauled by the invasion of 647, were incapable of extending their authority beyond the coastal cities, such as Hippo Regius, modern Annaba, and Carthage. The vacuum was filled by a number of autonomous Christian Romano-Berber states. The greater part of Mauritania, Algeria, and Morocco was already ruled by Berber kingdoms, Altaba and Quasensis, which gained independence after the Vandal mission of the 6th century. Queen Diha of Jerawa Zenata Berbers ruled a kingdom in the Ouras Mountains and resisted the Arab invasion for 5 years. Though it is known that Diha existed, most other details are the stuff of legends. The Muslims, no doubt surprised by her strength and ability to defeat the armies of Allah, believed her to be a sorceress, but her eventual defeat at the Battle of Tabarka around 702 ended Berber military power. By this time, the Arabs had taken the Byzantine strongholds, including Carthage, which the Arab general Hassan razed to the ground. Icosium, Algiers, fell in 700, and 9 years later the invaders reached the Atlantic coast. India before the Sultanate. The story of the Delhi Sultanate has come to the modern world through a number of different primary sources, ranging from Indian and Persian chronicles to Arab travel reports, epigraphs, and coins. These sources have allowed modern scholars to accurately reconstruct the chronology of the Delhi Sultanate and even to glimpse into what some of the greater sultans were thinking. But they are, unfortunately, for the most part, quiet on what the average subject of the Sultanate thought or how they lived their lives. The primary sources of the Delhi Sultanate, therefore, are comprised mostly of the accounts of the elites. The city of Delhi itself is located on the banks of the Ganges River in northern India, but at its height, the Sultanate stretched from Bengal in the east to Sindh in the west and included most of what is today India. In addition to India, the Delhi Sultanate also included most of the modern nation-states of Bangladesh, Pakistan, and part of Nepal, including millions of people from a plethora of religions and ethnic groups who spoke just as many languages. The men who chronicled the lives of Delhi sultans, as well as the cultural details and events of the Sultanate, included a number of Indian and Persian scholars who often wrote in Persian during the 14th century. Among the best known of these Muslim historians were Juzjani, Isami, and Barani. It should be noted that the chronicles these historians wrote were often biased, since these were commissioned by the sultans, so the writers had to tread lightly so as not to offend their benefactors. The historians also had definite religious and ethnic biases. The Persian and Arab cultures were viewed as the most enlightened, while non-Muslims, which included the pagan Mongols, as well as the Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, were often disparaged as infidels. Arab historians, travel writers, also commented on the Delhi Sultanate. The Arab writers were probably less biased, because they were often just visiting Delhi on trade or diplomatic missions, although they too had their own cultural and religious prejudices. Perhaps the best known of these writers, and the one who wrote the most about the Delhi Sultanate, was Ibn Battuta. Battuta is known for his travels through southeastern Eurasia and North Africa from 1325 to 1354, which he carefully chronicled in a journal originally written in Arabic that has since been translated and reprinted into dozens of languages. Because of Battuta's extensive travels, at a time when most people never went more than a few miles from their homes, and because he spent considerable time in China, Ibn Battuta is sometimes referred to as the Arab Marco Polo. Battuta visited India more than once, and served as a judge in Delhi during the rule of the Sultan Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. In addition to the historiographical sources, a number of inscriptions and numismatic evidence, along with art historical evidence, helps fill in some of the details of the Delhi Sultanate's chronology. Since the Delhi Sultanate did not suddenly form and was not created in a vacuum, it is important to examine northern India just prior to the formation of the Delhi Sultanate, and how events in the greater Islamic world played a role. When Islam formed as a religion in the 7th century, it moved like a storm throughout the Middle East, eventually entering Spain in the west and Persia and Afghanistan in the east. In Afghanistan, the Islamic vanguard was led by Turkish soldiers and Persian scholars, so by the time it arrived on the banks of the Indus River, it was well organized, unified, and able to take more land in India. In the 900s, the Muslims of the Sindh region were poised to take ever more land in the subcontinent, but the religion of Islam was really nothing new to most Indians at that time. The earliest examples of political Islam in the subcontinent were the Ghaznavid dynasty, which was a Muslim Turkish dynasty that held power over parts of Persia, Afghanistan and India from 977 to 1186. The Ghaznavids were challenged and eventually defeated by another Turkish Muslim dynasty known as the Ghurids that originated in the late 9th century in Afghanistan and lasted until 1215. The Ghurid dynasty began in Afghanistan, and after fighting with the Ghaznavids for several centuries, the Ghurids were finally able to establish themselves in India. The Ghurids would be the progenitors of the Delhi Sultanate, but before examining how that took place, it is important to consider how Islam first appeared in India. Islam's first military presence in the subcontinent took place long before the Ghaznavids or Ghurids entered the scene. In 715, the Umayyad Arab general Muhammad ibn Qasim conquered the Sindh region, bringing the new religion of Islam to the Indus Valley on the border with the much older religions of India. Despite Islam's sudden and violent thrust into the subcontinent, its conflict with the native non-Muslims was not necessarily inherent. For their part, the non-Muslims were willing to deal with the new Muslim presence as just the latest in a long line of many groups that had come through the region as warriors, diplomats, and merchants. Islam's martial presence on the subcontinent was predated by trade ties that Indians had with Arabs and Persians before Islam, dating back to the ancient era. The earliest iteration of the Silk Road was actually a combination of sea and overland routes that connected India to the Middle East and East Africa. And even before the Silk Road existed, and even longer before Islam was a religion, Indian merchants traded with their Mesopotamian counterparts via sea routes. Despite the seemingly peaceful and benign origins of contacts between India and the Near East, there is no doubt that the Delhi Sultanate was born from conflict and bloodshed. The Ghurid dynasty, also known as the Shamsa-Bani dynasty, originated in the Ghur region of Afghanistan as primarily Turkish warrior slaves, but also with considerable influence from Persians and other ethnic groups. The Ghurids originally followed the pagan shamanistic religion of the steppes, but converted to Islam under the rule of the Ghaznavids in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Ghurids rose in influence, eventually becoming the backbone of the Ghaznavid army despite their servile status, until they overthrew the Ghaznavids and took control of most of Afghanistan and the northern subcontinent. Once the Ghurid dynasty was established, its rulers looked to the west for inspiration, encouraging immigration from other Islamic lands, especially Persia and Turkish-speaking lands. The first several Ghurid sultans ruled like warlords, with little concern for the future, but that changed when Mu'izz al-Din Muhammad, who ruled from 1173 to 1202, and from 1202 to 1206 as the sole ruler, also known as Muhammad of Ghur, came to the throne. Like his predecessors, Muhammad was quite ambitious, but he was also visionary. Muhammad's long-term plans included expanding Islam's hold in India through a combination of military conquests, diplomacy and trade, and developing a unique administrative system where merit was rewarded and slaves had most of the best positions. These warrior slaves were Turkish in ethnicity and language, and Muslim in religion, but their homeland was wherever they conquered and as far as their horses could ride. About 2 years after Muhammad came to the throne with his brother Ghiyat al-Din Muhammad, Mu'izz began his series of military campaigns that continued for most of his reign. Muhammad began by occupying the forts of Multan and Uk, which gave him the ability to control the Sindh region. Muhammad knew that control of the forts gave his army the advantage of not only being in defensible positions, but also slowly but surely claiming new territory that was formerly controlled by the Ghaznavids or Hindu princes. Both of these groups were obstacles to Muhammad's aspirations, but he was aided by the fact that they did not present a unified front against him. After gaining control of Sindh, Muhammad moved east and garrisoned many of the urban centers of northern India. From those garrisons, Muhammad's army defeated the last of the Muslim Ghaznavids in Punjab and took Lahore, and also defeated many of the remaining Hindu princes in northern India. Muhammad's early military successes, and those that the Delhi Sultanate would later enjoy, were largely the result of the Turkish Bandagan. The Bandagan were the highly trained Turkish military slaves that led Muhammad's army. Modern Westerners have a difficult time trying to grasp the concept of the Bandagan because despite the fact they were slaves, their status was much different from the chattel slaves of the Americas, the serfs of medieval Europe, or even slaves in the ancient world. Turkish military slaves were esteemed for their abilities, rewarded for their success, and could rise through the hierarchy of India's Islamic society. Moreover, since the Bandagan were all slaves, they viewed each other as equals, developing a distinct esprit de corps that set them apart from other armies of the era. The Bandagan were also extremely loyal to their lords' owners, which is another aspect of this unique form of slavery that many modern Westerners may find difficult to grasp. Although the Bandagan were privileged, they were initially kept separate from the nobility, but that changed when Muhammad had no male heirs. He rewarded his army of slaves by giving them everything he had conquered as an inheritance. The Persian Indian historian Minhaj al-Siraj Juzjani wrote, "While other rulers may have 1 or 2 sons, I have many thousand sons. In other words, my Turkish slaves and my dominions will be their inheritance. After my death, they will preserve my name in the Friday sermons read in my dominions." Muhammad was correct, for it was his army of slaves that gave birth to the first dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate. The early Sultanate. Among Muhammad's army of capable Turkish slaves, none was more capable than Qutb al-Din Aybak, who ruled from 1206 to 1210. Aybak became a slave at an early age, but distinguished himself on the battlefield for the Ghurids, earning praise, wealth, and possession. Eventually, Aybak became Muhammad's most capable and trusted general, and, after the Sultan died, he inherited most of the kingdom and became the father of Delhi's Mamluk or slave dynasty. Although Aybak lost the region of Ghazni, he held the area from Lahore to Delhi in northern India, which became the core area of the Delhi Sultanate. After Aybak established his rule in Delhi, though, the transfer of power proved to be a bit tricky. Although the Turkish slaves of northern India were educated, capable, and even affluent, they were still slaves, which proved to be a hindrance in some ways to their rule. The fact was, despite their achievements and seeming freedom, the Mamluks were still slaves tied to certain individuals and families. The Mamluk slaves could rise in the Delhi government hierarchy and even become sultans, but in many ways they were better suited to being kingmakers instead of kings, which became evident almost immediately after Aybak came to power. The slaves immediately realized how much power they had, and the concept of fraternity they had under Muhammad quickly dissipated into factions that vied for power. This situation became evident when Aybak died suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving the throne open for contenders to claim the throne, because, like Muhammad before him, Aybak only had daughters. A faction that was loyal to Aybak, known as the Qutbi faction, supported Aram Shah as the Sultan because they believed he represented order and was easier to control. Not everyone in Delhi's slave army was happy with the choice, including Shams al-Din Iltutmish. Some modern scholars consider Iltutmish as the true first Delhi Sultan, as he ruled from the city and molded it into what it would become for the remainder of the Sultanate. But first, Iltutmish would have to come to the throne, which was no easy task, considering that the Mamluk dynasty was a new dynasty formed by slaves. According to Ibn Battuta, Iltutmish had public opinion on his side. As Ibn Battuta put it, after this, Shams ad-Din became possessed of the kingship here, having been appointed thereto by the general consent of the people, and he governed India for 20 years. He was a just, learned, and religious prince. The details of Iltutmish's rise and Aram Shah's fall are sparse, although Aram Shah was noted as having been martyred. The manner in which Aram was killed is not as important as how Iltutmish was able to insinuate himself into the position. Iltutmish apparently knew how to work the different factions in Delhi to his advantage by awarding influential individuals with key positions and by developing an administrative system that was loyal and efficient at the same time. Iltutmish continued to garner support from the important military slaves, but that group was quite complex, encompassing nearly every corner of Delhi society and often blurring the line between them and the nobles. The Sultan's focus was on the most educated, best-skilled people, no matter their background, so two influential groups formed, the Al-e-Saif, or people of the sword, and the Al-e-Kalam, or people of the pen. The Turkish slaves comprised the vast majority of the first category, while Persians were the core of the second category, at least early in the Sultanate, although both groups overlapped. Islamic scholars and civil servants often served time in the military, and military officers would often serve as civil administrators. Iltutmish also followed a policy of relative religious tolerance, allowing Hindus to practice their religion and to even become members of the ruling class. This is not to say that Iltutmish and later Delhi sultans treated India's many religions on an equal footing with Islam. Non-Muslims were required to pay a tax and observe Islamic law to a certain extent, and wars between the Muslims of the north and the Hindus of the south continued, but it was nothing on the level seen in the Middle East at the time. Iltutmish became known for his fairness in his dealings, not only with the Hindus living within his own kingdom, but also toward people from outside the Delhi Sultanate. When Iltutmish came to the throne, the geopolitical situation was rapidly evolving outside India. In the Middle East, the European Christians were fighting with the Seljuk Turks and what was left of the Abbasid Caliphate, while Central Asia and the Eurasian steppe were being overwhelmed by the Mongols. The Mongols represented a new potential threat to India that was vastly different from anything Iltutmish had encountered, as they were not Muslim, Christian, or Hindu when they first arrived in the region. Iltutmish demonstrated his political acuity by not making the mistake of those who came before him by attacking the Mongols, and instead developed diplomatic relations with them that proved to be successful for several decades. The Sultan also worked extensively on modernizing the Delhi Sultanate. As Iltutmish developed the system that promoted men of the sword and men of the pen based on merit, he also created many of the technical elements of the government. Iltutmish revamped the mint in Delhi and had it issue new silver coins that were standardized and pure. A social welfare program was also created, whereby water and food were provided to Delhi's needy inhabitants. Ibn Battuta noted, "Without the city is a reservoir for the rainwater, and out of this the inhabitants have their water for drinking. It is 2 miles in length and 1 in width. About it are pleasure gardens to which the people resort." Iltutmish pointed to Quranic verses and the pillar known as zakat that requires practicing Muslims to give alms or charity. It is for these reasons that Iltutmish gained the consent of the people, as mentioned earlier, and why he was written about positively by later scholars, but his death brought about another period of confusion and turmoil in Delhi. Another reason why Iltutmish is often thought to be the first true Delhi Sultan and the progenitor of the Mamluk dynasty is because several of his freeborn children were heirs to the throne. Because Iltutmish was a slave, it made the dynastic transition much more interesting and at times more volatile. The crown prince was Nasir al-Din, but he died in 1229, which left several options. The prince Rukn al-Din, though, decided to take matters into his own hands and limit the sultan's options to himself. According to Ibn Battuta, when Iltutmish died, Rukn made his move against his brothers. After his death, his son Rukn ad-Din took possession of the throne, but polluted his reign by killing his brothers and was therefore killed himself. Rukan ruled for less than 1 year, and in that time angered the powerful military slaves as well as the nobles, perhaps sensing that Delhi was ruled by a weak leader with little support from the military or the aristocrats. The Mongols also began raiding Sindh and lands on Delhi's western borders during Rukan's short rule. It was all too much for the military slaves, who decided to remove Rukan from the throne and kill him. It was at this point that the Delhi Sultanate's history took a couple of interesting turns. First, the military slaves decided that Iltutmish's dynasty should continue, but who they would get to fill the void was a bit complicated. Rukan did not kill all of his brothers, but even when Iltutmish was still alive, he favored his daughter Razia. The slaves made the bold and unprecedented move of putting Razia on the throne as a sultana, where she ruled for about 4 years, from 1236 to 1240. Razia was apparently not afraid to rule and be seen in the otherwise quite patriarchal world. According to Ibn Battuta, upon this, the army agreed to place his sister El-Malika Razia upon the throne, who reigned 4 years. This woman usually rode about among the army, just as men do. She, however, gave up the government on account of some circumstances that presented themselves. The military slaves likely thought they could control Razia better than if she were a man, but she apparently became too much for them to handle because she was overthrown by the nobles and slaves in favor of Mu'iz al-Din Bahram Shah. Razia was killed in 1240, attempting to win back the throne, and was the only sultana of the Delhi Sultanate. Razia's removal from the throne is the second incredible turn in these events, but the ability for the slaves to be kingmakers or breakers is the more important story in the wider historical context. The generals of the Delhi Sultanate's military may still have been slaves technically, but they were just as powerful, if not more, than any freeborn Turkish or Indian noble of the era. The Turkish slaves were still the true power behind the Delhi throne in the mid-13th century, but their Machiavellian tactics and duplicity began to negatively affect the state's stability. Bahram attempted to curtail the power of the slaves by developing new networks of allies among the slaves, as well as the free-born Indians, and he was even able to temporarily expel the slaves from Delhi. But eventually the slaves defeated and overthrew him too. The Mamluk dynasty was then thrust into a period of turmoil, where several forgettable sultans came to the throne at the pleasure of the slaves. The chaos began to be resolved when Ghiyas al-Din Balban came to the throne in 1266, which also marked the beginning of the transition to a new dynasty. Balban rose through the ranks of the Turkish military slaves to become deputy sultan under Nasir al-Din Mahmud Shah, even marrying Nasir's mother to become the true power behind the throne. As mentioned earlier, the sultans, after Iltutmish in the Mamluk dynasty, were often weak and ineffective in the face of the powerful slaves, but as a slave himself, Balban had an advantage. He could use his background to appeal to warrior slaves, and his background also gave him the knowledge of the moves of those who did not join him would make. When turmoil overwhelmed Delhi once more after the death of Nasir, who left behind no male heirs, Balban declared himself sultan at the age of 60. Although Balban was only connected to Iltutmish's family through marriage, it was good enough for the slaves and nobles, and those who were opposed to the situation soon found out how ruthless Balban was. The Turkish military slaves could rise to influential positions in the Delhi Sultanate, but it was never easy to do so. Balban began his life as a lowly water carrier, and only rose after much hardship and violence. Almost as soon as he became sultan, Balban began having all his opponents, slave and free, rich and poor, murdered or exiled. He was particularly fond of poisoning his enemies, who, after a while, did whatever they could to avoid Balban's invitations to dine. The terror that Balban struck in the hearts and minds of people across northern India was effective, though, as the usurper sultan held the throne for more than 20 years before dying of old age. which was a rarity among Delhi sultans. When Balban was not fighting off potential assassins and usurpers, he was building up his state's defences against outsiders. Balban effectively developed a series of forts during his rule to protect the Delhi Sultanate from the Mongols. Many of these forts were built earlier by Muhammad during his conquest of northern India and re-garrisoned by Balban, but Balban also built new ones. By the late 13th century, the Mongols had become such a powerful force that they were no longer placated by words or payments, simply taking what they wanted when they wanted. India's wealth was an enticement to any people, so the Mongols began attempting to take what they could during raids, but the Sultanate forces were able to stop them for the most part. Unfortunately for the Sultanate, though, Balban was an old man when he came to the throne, so the succession was unclear, and he simply did not have the time or possibly the ability to prepare his people for the future. After Balban died, the throne passed to his grandson, Mu'izz al-Din Kai Kabad, who was then murdered by a noble from Khalji. Kai Kabad's 3-year-old son, Shams al-Din Kuyamaz, nominally ruled for a few months at the pleasure of the slave army, but for all intents and purposes, the Mamluk dynasty was dead, and the Delhi Sultanate entered a new phase of its history. The height of the Sultanate. The 14th century proved to be the apogee of the Delhi Sultanate, when its cultural, economic, and military influence spread beyond the subcontinent as far east as China and west into Europe. Two dynasties ruled Delhi during this period: the Khalji, 1290 to 1320, and the Tughlaq, 1320 to 1413. Sultans from both these dynasties led armies to expand the Sultanate's borders, patronized the arts, promoted trade, and invited scholars from outside India to live in Delhi and lend their expertise to the Sultanate. It is no coincidence that most of the Persian and Arab historians and chroniclers who wrote about the Delhi Sultanate did so during this period, and it is also not surprising that most of the Delhi Sultanate's permanent monuments were built during these two dynasties. The Khalji dynasty was named for a town in Afghanistan where the family originated. The rebellion that brought the Khalji dynasty to power was described by Ibn Battuta. At this time, his Nawab, Jalal-ud-Din Firoz Shah el-Kilaji, revolted, taking his station upon a high mount without the city. Mu'izz-ud-Din sent his emirs for the purpose of giving him battle, but they all, one after another, joined him and proclaimed him emperor. Jalal-ud-Din then entered the city, and enclosing Mu'izz-ud-Din within his palace for days, overcame him, put him to death, and took possession of his kingdom. This Jalal-ud-Din was a mild and well-informed prince. He governed India for 2 years. Jalal actually ruled closer to 6 years if the brief period where Kai Kabad's son was nominally on the throne is considered. The brief psychological description Battuta offered of Jalal is perhaps, in many ways, indicative of the relatively short Khalji dynasty. Although there were only 5 Khalji sultans, they were known for being relatively productive, effective, and fair. With that said, the Khaljis were not immune to the palace intrigue and violence that was endemic to the Delhi Sultanate. Jalal had a son and a daughter, and, as was often the tradition in pre-modern times, he gave his daughter to his brother's son for marriage. Jalal had hoped that by marrying his daughter to Alauddin, it would bring the family together and make the Khalji dynasty stronger, but instead it proved to be Jalal's undoing. Alauddin was an ambitious young man, but he was also constantly broke, which can be a lethal combination in any era and in any part of the world. Battuta wrote, "The uncle had given him the government of Kara and Manikpur, containing 2 of the most populous districts in India." Alauddin, however, had an eye to the kingdom. The only difficulty he had to contend with was his want of money, for he had none, except what he got by his sword in making new conquests. Alauddin discovered some buried treasures on one of his military campaigns, which he then used to build an even bigger army. Perhaps sensing that his nephew was about to get the upper hand, Jalal made the first move. Ibn Battuta continued, "It happened that his uncle undertook an expedition against him and summoned him before him, but he refused to appear. The uncle then prepared to go to him, for he said, 'This young man is my son, I will therefore go to him.' The nephew accordingly met him, which happened upon the banks of the Ganges, in the very place where Mu'izz-ud-Din and Nuri-ud-Din had formerly met, and, like them, each rode into the middle of the river. Alauddin, however, had commanded his followers that, at the time he should embrace his uncle Jalal-ud-Din, they were to kill him. When, therefore, the parties met, and the nephew was in the act of embracing the uncle, the followers of the nephew killed him, which put Alauddin in possession of his uncle's army, and all proclaimed him emperor. If the assassination of Jalal had happened in other states, it may have been a cause for concern and a source of internal instability, but it was par for the course in the Delhi Sultanate. Moreover, if anything, Alauddin was a more capable and stronger ruler than his uncle. The Delhi Sultanate continued to face pressure from the Mongols, and in response, its leaders developed a number of different solutions. The historians Minhaj, Barani, and Isami all wrote about the Mongol raids on Delhi, although their accounts were quite biased to say the least, as they depicted the nomads as physically ugly, uncivilized, and otherwise culturally inferior to the people of northern India. The Sindh region was hardest hit, with Delhi itself escaping relatively unscathed. No doubt the forts the early Delhi sultans built and developed played a role in stemming the Mongol tide, but so too did a little luck and elements that were outside of Delhi's control. The Mongols had become a bit overextended by the early 14th century, attacking kingdoms in the Middle East, as well as Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire fragmented in 1259 into several khanates that were still quite formidable, but nowhere near as deadly as the united horde that Genghis Khan and his sons led. The general disruption that the Mongols caused throughout Eurasia also proved to be a benefit in some ways for the Delhi Sultanate. Muslim scholar refugees from the Near East made their way to India, where the Khalji and later the Tughlaq sultans welcomed them and their skills. Still, the Delhi sultans had to be on constant guard from new threats. After Alauddin secured his position as sultan, he had to protect the western border from the Mongols. Although appeasement was usually how kingdoms survived Mongol onslaughts in the 13th and 14th centuries, Alauddin apparently believed the Delhi Sultanate was in a strong enough position to resist. When a group of Mongols visited Delhi and asked Alauddin for tribute payment, he responded by executing all of them. The move was an act of war that Alauddin must have certainly known would invite a Mongol response of some type, either a putative expedition or a full-scale invasion. The Mongols responded in 1305 with an invasion of the subcontinent, but once again, the forts that the early Delhi sultans built helped stem the tide. Sultanate forces garrisoned in the former forts of Sunam and Samana in the Punjab region were able to halt the Mongol advance. Once the Sultanate's borders were secure, the leaders could focus on internal policies. The Khalji sultans pursued a domestic policy that was much more open and far less theocratic than many Islamic dynasties before and after them. The Khaljis ruled more according to Zawabit, state laws, than Sharia, Islamic law, although this is not to say they were secular. As will be discussed more later, Islamic law did have a place in the Delhi Sultanate generally, as well as during the Khalji dynasty, but it was a far less militant form than what was practiced further to the west. The concept of jihad played far less of a role in the Delhi Sultanate, and although the sultans were descended from Turkish nomadic warriors, the Turkish Islamic idea of the Ghazi, Muslim Turkish raiders, was also for the most part obsolete. The Delhi Sultans of the Khalji dynasty strove to assert their dominance by inviting the most skilled people from the outside world, which included Indian-born Muslims, Hindus, and even Mongols. The Khaljis viewed themselves as pious Muslims, but they also saw war as only a last resort option. For the Khaljis, protecting the Delhi state was more important than expanding the realm of Islam through jihad. Although the Khalji sultans relied far less on their Ghazi warriors than the Mamluks did, they still comprised the core of the Sultanate's army. After Alauddin died in 1316, the manner of which remains somewhat of a mystery, although the official cause was a prolonged illness, the Delhi Sultanate was once more thrust into a period of chaos. The military leaders once again began playing the primary role in the government as kingmakers, which opened the door for an ambitious officer named Ghazi Malik to rise through the ranks. Malik's background is somewhat of a mystery, although it is likely that his father was a slave warrior who served in the Delhi Sultanate's army. When the turmoil began after Alauddin's death, Malik was given command of the Punjab region, giving him control of a sizable force he used to capture and behead the last Khalji sultan, Khusro Khan. Malik then took the name Ghiyas al-Din Tughlaq and became the first sultan of the Tughlaq dynasty. Ghiyas began his reign as sultan just as he had lived his life up until that point by leading several military expeditions. He fought the Mongol advance in Punjab just as his Khalji predecessors had, but he even more actively campaigned against Hindu kingdoms in southern India. India was still predominantly Hindu in the 14th century, but the Delhi Sultans were much more organized and had unified the Muslim population in such a way that they were able to defeat the divided Hindu kingdoms in most major campaigns. The last significant Hindu holdout was the Vijayanagar Empire, which was based in the Deccan region and controlled the southern third of the subcontinent. Unable to advance farther south or west, Ghiyas focused his energies on strengthening the Sultanate internally. The war between the Vijayanagar Empire and the Delhi Sultanate would continue through the remainder of the Sultanate's history, but the borders would change very little, and its prosecution from Delhi side would be left to other rulers. As mentioned earlier, the Tughlaq dynasty, along with the Khalji dynasty, was the high point of the Delhi Sultanate, primarily because of the leader's domestic policies. And although the Tughlaq dynasty was birthed through the usurpation of the Khalji dynasty, there was a high degree of social and political continuity. Ghiyas continued the Khalji dynasty policy of awarding merit in the government, which then became a central tenet of the Tughlaq dynasty's overall philosophy. The Tughlaq sultans also continued to invite skilled and educated foreigners into India, but they added the provision of often making them sign a document that they would not immediately leave. The law helped the Tughlaq dynasty retain the most skilled people, thereby ensuring that the Sultanate would be strong culturally and economically. Trade and politics in Delhi. The Delhi Sultanate's culture is what made the state unique and important for several centuries, yet it was its economic and political systems that were often behind the flourishing of the culture. Merchants and traders from Delhi supplied the Sultanate with the wealth it needed to build the magnificent mosques and to commission the historians and poets who would become synonymous with the Sultanate, and it was through trade routes that new ideas made their way into northern India. The Delhi Sultanate's political structure also allowed for the cultural flourishing that took place during the Khalji and Tughlaq dynasties, because despite the common violent usurpations that took place from dynasty to dynasty and within dynasties, all rulers patronized important cultural institutions. The Delhi Sultans knew that maintaining a strong economy was the key to military and cultural strength. Delhi was home to what was, at the time, a modern mint, and coins were regularly issued during the rules of most of the sultans, which has proven to be an excellent primary source of evidence. The city of Delhi was alive with trade in the form of several markets, where locals bought and sold goods, and foreign merchants brought their wares to the larger markets. Ibn Battuta wrote extensively how Hindustan, the Arabic term for India, was the source for fruits, such as oranges, grapes, and berries, as well as spices, rice, grains, sesame, and sugarcane, which were all in demand in the Near East. Slavery played such an important role in the creation of the Delhi Sultanate, and it was also an important factor in its economy, especially in and around the city of Delhi proper. But the primary force behind the Delhi Sultanate's economic success was its extensive trade routes that connected it to the outside world. Long before Islam was a religion, Indian merchants developed extensive overland and sea trade routes with China to the east and the Near East to the west. The first era of the Silk Road lasted from the late 2nd century BC to mid-3rd century CE, connecting Han China, Rome, Parthian Persia, and the Kushan Empire of Afghanistan and northern India. Although the Mongol invasions temporarily caused disruptions to the overland routes, the ancient sea routes were maintained by a network of Hindu and Muslim merchants. Ibn Battuta took part in these routes when he visited India's Malabar coast, southwest India, during his travels. He noted, "In this place are some of the greatest merchants of Persia and Yemen. Ginger and black pepper are here in great abundance. The king of this place is the greatest of the kings of Malabar, and in it are about 4,000 Mohammedan merchants. The merchants would export these spices and import frankincense from Arabia, wool from Europe, and silk from China, just to name a few items, eventually finding their way into Delhi. The area around Delhi was the site of several settlements in the ancient era, and the modern spelling of the name actually comes from the period of British occupation. When the Mamluk dynasty was first established, the city was a regional centre, but under their rule it quickly grew to be a major centre in the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta described the sites. We then proceeded on from Masud Abad till we came to Delhi, the capital of the empire. It is a most magnificent city, combining at once both beauty and strength. Its walls are such as to have no equal in the whole world. This is the greatest city of Hindustan, and indeed of all Islamism in the East. It now consists of 4 cities, which, becoming contiguous, have formed one. This city was conquered in the year of the Hejira, 584, 1188 in the Common Era. The thickness of its walls is 11 cubits. They keep grain in the city for a very long time, without its undoing any change whatsoever. Battuta's account demonstrates that over the course of about 150 years, the city had grown to the point that it was considered one of the world's greatest Islamic cities. By the time Battuta visited and lived in Delhi, he had visited some of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, including Cairo, Damascus, Mecca, and Baghdad. Outside of the city proper was a military camp, where a garrison was kept on duty year-round. 14th century Delhi would be teeming with religious scholars and merchants from India, as well as others from around the world, rubbing shoulders with soldiers, slaves, and nobles on any given day. Holding it all together was the large and well-developed bureaucracy. Early in the Delhi Sultanate's history, the top administrative positions were held by slaves who functioned as both men of the pen and men of the sword. But by the time of the Tughlaq dynasty, those positions had opened to a greater pool of people, including foreigners. The 2 top positions in the Delhi Sultanate's administration were the Kotwal and the Qazi. The Kotwal was a true bureaucrat, and it was his job to ensure that the civil administration functioned properly by appointing other officials to carry out various tasks. The Qazis were judges who were appointed to lifetime positions. Similar to modern judges, Qazis were required to know civil and criminal law, but they also needed to be well versed in Sharia. The most famous of Delhi's Qazis was Ibn Battuta, who was appointed to the position by the Sultan Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. Batuta described his appointment. "When I was called, I went in and did homage. The vizier said, 'The Lord of the world appoints you to the office of judge in Delhi. He also gives you a dress of honor with a saddled horse, as also 12,000 dinars for your present support. He has moreover appointed you a yearly salary of 12,000 dinars, and a portion of lands in the villages, which will produce annually an equal sum.' I then did homage according to their custom, and withdrew." Batuta described how the job could be thankless, and was a money pit. "In a short time, however, I found myself involved in great debts, amounting to about 55,000 dinars, according to the computation of India, which, with them, amount to 5,500 tankas, which, according to the computation of the West, will amount to 13,000 dinars. The reason for this debt was the great expenses incurred in waiting on the emperor during his journeys to repress the revolt of Ain el-Mulk." Batuta spent the next 7 years in Delhi, basically a prisoner to Muhammad's capricious whims and the ever-changing political situation of the subcontinent. He assiduously documented his interactions and observations of Delhi during that time, giving modern scholars a wealth of information about the inner workings of the Sultanate, as well as a peek into the psychology of arguably its greatest sultan. Muhammad ibn Tughlaq is considered by many modern historians to be the greatest sultan of the Tughlaq dynasty, and perhaps the most effective and strongest of all the Delhi sultans. His achievements included defending India from Mongol invasions, developing in-depth relations with outsiders from the East and West, and a number of public works projects, but he was also known for extreme acts of violence and cruelty. Muhammad was the oldest son of Ghiyas, but according to Ibn Battuta, he was not Ghiyas's favorite, at least not until Muhammad decided to eliminate the competition. Ibn Battuta wrote, "Now the emperor had a second son, who was a great favorite with him. In consequence of this, the elder brother Muhammad very much feared lest he should be appointed successor to the throne. When, therefore, the different orders, as well as those who had come to welcome the Sultan, had concluded the banquet, the elephants were presented before him. But when the elephant's foot came in contact with the place appointed, down came the palace upon the head of the Sultan Tughlaq, his favorite son, and the courtiers who were assembled before him, and all perished. Muhammad, the present emperor, accordingly took possession of the throne, having been proclaimed by the emirs and people, and thus was the kingdom purged of his enemies." This violent situation set the tone for how Muhammad would rule, and the paranoia that seemingly overwhelmed him at times. With that said, despite the paranoia, or possibly because of it, Muhammad expanded the Delhi Sultanate's territory and was an effective ruler. Rebellions were always a potential problem during the Delhi Sultanate, and the standard way to put them down was through sheer brute force, although Muhammad devised other ways to placate his recalcitrant subjects. Muhammad took full advantage of the system of forts and garrisons the Mamluk slaves developed by continuing to fund and staff them, as well as visit them himself. When Muhammad was not in Delhi, he often spent time in the northern city of Kanauj, which allowed him to personally oversee maneuvers in the region. Once Muhammad solidified his position in the north, he was able to focus on expanding the Sultanate to the south and protect its western flank. As mentioned earlier, most of southern India was controlled by the Hindu Vijayanagar Empire, and later there were other, smaller Islamic sultanates in the south as well. To counter any potential move by these other states, Muhammad forcibly moved thousands of Turco-Persian elites from northern India to the Deccan region of southern India, which amounted to about 10% of India's Muslim population. The capital was also temporarily moved from Delhi to the south, with a large share of its population either being forced directly to move or to follow in order to keep their livelihood. The forced migration served two purposes that helped solidify Muhammad's hold on power. First, it placed any potential usurpers far from Delhi, where they would no longer, or at least be far less of a threat. living on the marshes of the Sultanate made these Turco-Persian migrants even more loyal to Muhammad, because he alone could guarantee their safety from the Hindus. Along those same lines, the new migrants served as a buffer between Delhi and the states to the south, so any attempts by the southerners to move north would first be met by the new inhabitants who were loyal to Delhi. According to Ibn Battuta, not all of Delhi's subjects were happy with some of Muhammad's methods, and even voiced their displeasure, which brought out the more capricious aspects of the Sultan's personality. This emperor was one of the most bountiful and splendidly munificent men where he took, but in other cases one of the most impetuous and inexorable, and very seldom did it happen that pardon followed his anger. On one occasion he took offence at the inhabitants of Delhi on account of the numbers of its inhabitants who had revolted, and the liberal support which these had received from the rest, and to such a pitch did the quarrel rise that the inhabitants wrote a letter consisting of several pages in which they very much abused him. The consequence was he ordered all the inhabitants to quit the place, and upon some delay being evinced, he made a proclamation stating that what person soever, being an inhabitant of that city, should be found in any of its houses or streets, should receive condign punishment. Upon this they all went out. This account is likely connected to Muhammad's forced movement of the Turco-Persian elites to the south, and the temporary move of the capital to the Deccan region. Battuta added that Muhammad also had a cruel streak, devising particularly creative ways to torture and kill his enemies. He had some of his trusted mahouts, elephant drivers, train elephants to specifically attack and rip men apart from limb to limb. Upon a certain day, when I myself was present, some men were brought out who had been accused of having attempted the life of the vizier. They were ordered accordingly to be thrown to the elephants, which had been taught to cut their victims to pieces. Their hoofs were cased with sharp iron instruments, and the extremities of these were like knives. Once Muhammad suppressed most internal rebellion and dissension and secured his southern border, he was able to focus on the always problematic western border with the Mongols. The Mongols continue to be a threat, but instead of dealing with them reactively, as most Delhi sultans had done, Muhammad decided to take the fight to them. Muhammad personally led a punitive expedition into Afghanistan against the Mongols, who were ruled by Tar Mashirin Khan at the time. Although Tar Mashirin was a threat to most people on the borders of his Khanate, he was a Muslim, at least nominally, so Muhammad and other Muslim rulers could find some common ground with him. This situation quickly changed, though, when Mongol pagans overthrew Tar Mashirin in 1334 and initiated a reign of terror on their own people, sending Muslim Mongol refugees into several adjoining states. Many Muslim Mongol refugees made their way into the Delhi Sultanate, where Muhammad welcomed them as merchants and warriors for his army. Muslim Mongol refugees aided Muhammad in his campaigns against the rebellious regions of Gujarat and Sindh in 1350-51. Muhammad died in 1351 while on campaign, leaving behind a conflicting legacy and a much diminished empire. Although Muhammad was effective at putting down rebellions, the external enemies of the Sultanate slowly picked away at its borders, and some of the Turco-Persian elites moved to the Deccan region, establishing their own sultanates. After the 1-month rule of Mahmud ibn Muhammad, Firoz Shah Tughlaq came to the throne in Delhi. Firoz began his reign with a physically diminished, yet relatively stable state, but ended his time on the throne in chaos. Firoz's rule marked a shift in political philosophy in many ways, from the ideas that began during the Khalji dynasty. The policy of courting foreign scholars and technicians was ended, and Delhi returned to its place of prominence in the Sultanate. There could be several reasons for the first point, including a lack of funds to pay foreigners, or competition from other emerging Islamic states in India, which is likely related to the second point. A primary reason why the focus of the Sultanate returned to Delhi proper is because the Sultanate lost control of the Deccan region, not to the Hindus, but to the very Muslim elites with whom Muhammad populated the area. The smaller Bahmani Sultanate, formed in 1347 by the Turco-Persian elites, would last until 1527. The Bahmani state proved to be powerful enough to resist Delhi to the north and the Vijay-Anagara Empire, partially due to the development of pyrotechnic weapons sometime around 1368. Towards the end of Firoz's rule, the Delhi state had become quite disjointed, dividing into factions that began to fight for control over regions of India. After Firoz died, a succession of weak rulers came to the Delhi throne, and civil war continued until the end of the dynasty in 1413. But the biggest blow to the dynasty came once again from the west, this time in the form of the notorious warlord Timur. Although Timur was not a Mongol, he claimed descent from Genghis Khan, and could sow violent destruction every bit as much as the legendary Mongol leader. Timur was nominally a Muslim, but that did not stop him from attacking the Delhi Sultanate, defeating its armies, and plundering Delhi for more than a week. The stability of the Delhi Sultanate was permanently ruined, but in its place, the Mughals, who were legatees of Timur, rose in power in India. But the Delhi Sultans were not quite ready to give up all their power in the early 15th century. Culture in the Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate had many great leaders who compare favorably to those from other parts of the world during the same era. The Sultans of Delhi fought to expand their kingdom's borders, engaged diplomatically with Muslims and non-Muslims throughout Eurasia, and conducted trade with a similar number of people. But what made the Delhi Sultanate great and unique was its culture. Some of Delhi's cultural attributes have already been discussed, particularly in regards to politics and economics, although the Sultanate became known throughout the world for its art, architecture, literature, and religious scholars. During the Khalji and Tughlaq dynasties, the Delhi Sultanate became the center of learning in the Islamic world, especially after the European Crusades of the late 11th through 13th centuries, and the Mongol sacking of Baghdad in 1258. These unfortunate events for Muslims in the Near East proved to be the impetus that led to Delhi's cultural flourishing in the 13th and 14th centuries. One of the most unique and enduring aspects of the Delhi Sultanate's culture was its court and nobility. It has been discussed how the Mamluk dynasty was largely comprised of slaves who ascended into positions of power. Many of these slaves eventually became former slaves, although many still remained technically slaves, despite becoming commanders in the military and sometimes even marrying into the nobility. The unique status of Turkish slaves in the Delhi Sultanate faded after the Mamluk dynasty, but Delhi's court culture became even more pronounced. The Sultan was the center of a lively court culture that included poets, specialists, such as doctors and scientists, architects and artists, historians and musicians. Scholarship of all academic disciplines was patronized and fostered by the sultans, who wanted to be viewed as intellectual peers with the rulers in other older Islamic states in the Near East. Although the founders of the Delhi Sultanate were Turkish slave warriors, those men were heavily influenced by Persian culture, which was reflected throughout northern India in the Middle Ages. The subjects of the Delhi Sultanate were a variety of different ethnicities. Turkish, Indian, and Persian were the most common, but there were many more, and a plethora of languages were spoken throughout the empire. But there is little doubt that Turkish and Persian traditions were the most important. Turkish was the most important language in the early Sultanate's history, but as the nomad warriors became sedentary, and as the influential slaves evolved into nobles, Persian became the language of the elites and the educated. The Persian influence, which modern scholars know as Persianate, became evident in the Delhi Sultanate by the middle of the Mamluk dynasty. In terms of art, the Persianate style mixed with the native Indian styles, inspired by the Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu religions. The style of miniature painting, which is where elaborate scenes were painted on small pieces of paper, became popular in the 16th century, in the period immediately after the Delhi Sultanate. The miniature paintings of the 16th and 17th centuries were influenced by a number of earlier styles, including the Delhi Persianate style, seamlessly blending together influences from across cultures and eras. But the Delhi Sultanate is best known for its architectural style, which also took inspiration from a number of different places. A few of the most visible marks of the Delhi Sultanate that can still be seen throughout northern India are the many memorial pillars. The idea of erecting memorial pillars was not new to the Delhi Sultanate, nor to India, or the world for that matter. Ancient Egyptian kings erected pylons in the New Kingdom to commemorate their victories, real and perceived, and the Roman emperors had arches built to advertise their conquests. In India, Hindu kings began erecting commemorate pillars hundreds of years before the Delhi Sultans came to power. They generally erected two different types of pillars, those to demonstrate their overall fame, kirti stambhas, or those to commemorate a specific military victory, jaya stambhas. The pillars nearly always had religious connotations as well, as they were dedicated to a particular deity and were often within the precincts of a temple. Iltutmish set the precedent among Delhi sultans of reusing Hindu pillars by writing over the inscriptions as a palimpsest, which was not necessarily desecration, although temple desecration was quite common during the Delhi Sultanate. Among the many things Muiz al-Din Muhammad did, the desecration of Hindu temples is one of the more interesting. Modern scholars once believed that Muhammad's desecration of Hindu temples, as well as the desecrations committed by his Delhi successors, was driven entirely by religious zealotry and a hatred of anything pagan. But a closer look reveals this not to be the entire truth. Research shows that temple desecration was not uniquely Islamic or anti-Hindu, as Muslims occasionally despoiled other mosques, and Hindus often desecrated other Hindu temples as well as mosques. Temple desecration generally followed in the wake of a regime dynastic change, demonstrating the power and virility of the new rulers, more so than any animosity towards another religious group. Perhaps the greatest example of the mixing of artistic and architectural styles that came to personify the Delhi Sultanate in many ways was the Quwat al-Islam Mosque, or the Might of Islam Mosque in Delhi. The Quwat only slightly looks like a mosque one would find in Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Levant, because it was primarily built by native Hindu craftsmen who integrated Hindu and Persian styles. Work began on Quwat in 1191 under the rule of Aibak and continued for more than 100 years. It is important to note that the Quwat was much more than a single mosque, as it was a major religious complex that once housed several Hindu monuments. The size of the complex in its prime was described by Ibn Battuta. Its mosque is very large, and in the beauty and extent of its building, it has no equal. Before the taking of Delhi, it had been a Hindu temple, which the Hindus call El-Burkhana, but after that event it was used as a mosque. In its courtyard is a cell, to which there is no equal in the cities of the Mohammedans. Its height is such that men appear from the top of it like little children. In this court too there is an immense pillar, which is composed of stones from 7 different quarries. Its length is 30 cubits, its circumference 8, which is truly miraculous. The Quwat has endured some destruction and has changed hands in the centuries since Battuta visited it, but modern officials have preserved it well, for the most part. The mosque proper is flanked and surrounded by a number of monuments that are impressive in their own right. First, there is a 23-foot iron pillar that was originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. The pillar predated the mosque by 600 years and was inscribed with a Sanskrit text that praised Vishnu for guiding his followers to victory. This was just one of many pillars throughout northern India that were originally erected by Hindu rulers, but later reappropriated by Delhi sultans, although this was arguably the most important of these pillars. By far the most impressive part of the Kuwat, and what continues to draw the most visitors, is its 280 sandstone minaret, known as the Qutb Minar. Battuta mentioned both the minaret and the pillar, although his measurement of the pillar at 30 cubits, about 45 feet, was incorrect. Still, Battuta, who had by that time visited a good share of Eurasia and Africa, and had seen many wondrous sights, admitted the minaret and pillar were quite impressive. Construction on the Qutb Minar began during Aybak's rule, and was completed by Iltutmish. The impressive Qutb Minar was so tall, though, that it never functioned as a proper minaret for the call to prayer, and instead served as a monument to the greatness of the early Delhi Sultans and their allegiance to the Islamic faith. The Kuwat complex is rectangular in shape, enclosing the mosque, pillar and minaret neatly in a clearly defined sacred space. Two other notable parts of the mosque complex include the Alai Darwaza and the tomb of Iltutmish. The Alai Darwaza is the entrance to the complex, which was added in 1311 during the rule of Alauddin Khilji. The other notable monument is the tomb of Iltutmish, which, although unfinished, served as the template for later mausoleums in Islamic South Asia for centuries. The Kuwat complex was truly the pinnacle of Delhi Sultanate architecture, becoming an inspiration for Muslims around the world. But the Sultanate was also home to a number of other religious currents that were stirring underneath the surface of India. Religion was the key component that held all other aspects of the Delhi Sultanate together and gave it an identity. Like Christianity and most other major religions, Islam is comprised of several different sects that align with one of the two other major branches, and as noted earlier, the primary difference between the Sunnis and the Shia was who they believed was the rightful leader of the Islamic community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. Sunni Islam was, and still is, the majority branch of Islam, and was the branch followed by the Delhi Sultans, but Shia Islam has historically had a foothold in Persia, and from there it was brought to India. Despite Shia and Sunnis often going to war with each other in the Near East, there were few such conflicts in the Delhi Sultanate, with the sultans not viewing the branches as mutually exclusive. It should also be noted that Islamic law, Sharia, played an important role at different points in the Delhi Sultanate, especially during the Mamluk dynasty. As the early Delhi Sultans fostered an environment of scholarship and openness, inviting skilled people from throughout the world to live in the Sultanate, an important group that came in large numbers were the Sufis. Sufism is the practice of Islam that promotes asceticism, meditation and mysticism, among other aspects, and was a part of both major branches of Islam since the birth of the religion. Sufism was described in detail by the late 14th century Tunisian historian Ibn Khaldun in his History of the World. Sufism belongs to the sciences of the religious law that originated in Islam. It is based on the assumption that the practices of its adherents had always been considered by the important early Muslims, the men around Muhammad and the men of the second generation, as well as those who came after them, as the path of truth and right guidance. The Sufi approach is based upon constant application to divine worship, complete devotion to God, aversion to the false splendor of the world, abstinence from the pleasure, property, and position to which the great mass aspire, and retirement from the world into solitude for divine worship. Sufis, practitioners of Sufism, followed the first Islamic armies into the subcontinent and stayed, leaving a distinct influence on Indian Islam. The earlier Delhi Sultans had particular respect for Sufism, patronizing Sufis of the Chishti Sufi order. Although Sufism emphasizes the spiritual aspects of Islam, while Sharia focuses on the law, the two ideas are not mutually exclusive and could be found coexisting throughout the Delhi Sultanate. Muhammad ibn Tughlaq had a relationship with the Sufis that was at times contentious, although in the end it proved to be beneficial for both sides. Muhammad patronized the Chishti Sufi sect, and in return the Sufis gave legitimacy to his rule, despite the fact he was not considered a Sufi ruler. Muhammad's primary Sufi contact was Sheikh Nizam al-Din, who proclaimed that the Sufis had given him the kingdom. Even after Muhammad temporarily depopulated Delhi and moved the political capital to the Deccan region, the Sufis continued to support the Sultanate, giving the government religious legitimacy in the process. The two other important religious groups in the Delhi Sultanate were the ulama and the faqirs. The ulama were the religious scholars who administered Sharia throughout the Sultanate and were usually quite educated and proficient in Arabic and Persian. Ibn Battuta was an ulama, as were all the qazis and many of the historians who lived during the Delhi Sultanate mentioned in this book. The final group that should be mentioned were the faqirs, who, like the Sufis, were mystics, but the faqirs focused their practice on asceticism. Ibn Battuta met several Sufis and faqirs when he travelled throughout India, and claimed that he witnessed what some would consider a miracle. I saw in this place the Sheikh Salih Muhammad of Nisabur, one of the fanatical faqirs who suffered their hair to flow down loosely upon their shoulders. This man had 7 foxes with him, all of which ate and sat with the faqirs. There were also with him 30 other faqirs, one of whom had a gazelle, with a lion in the same place, which was unmolested by the lion. Although the Delhi Sultanate grew weak and eventually collapsed, its unique religious and artistic culture continued for hundreds of years under its successor, the Mughal Empire. The decline of the Sultanate. By the early 15th century, the Delhi Sultanate had experienced many phases of political growth and decline, but through it all, it was always viewed as a cultural beacon in the Islamic world. No matter how many assassinations, coups and rebellions took place, or even the temporary movement of the capital itself, Delhi's artistic, literary and religious ideas were always at the vanguard of trends in the era, which ultimately kept the city and the Sultanate relevant. However, when the Tughlaq dynasty descended into chaos, the political fragmentation that followed was also accompanied by a general decline in culture, or perhaps more accurately, a cultural stagnation that allowed other Islamic and Hindu dynasties in Asia to catch up. The Tughlaq dynasty was followed by the Sayyid dynasty, 1414 to 1451, although little is known about this family even today. The dynasty began with the rule of Khizr Khan, who was appointed by the warlord Timur as one of his vassals. 3 more sultans would come to the throne after Khizr, ruling from Delhi over a very truncated and culturally diminished sultanate. The Sayyid sultans may not have done much of significance during their rule, but some interesting developments did take place throughout India at the time. The development of gunpowder weapons, in the form of muskets and cannons, originated in Europe and began making their way east, possibly first being used by the Sayyids in India. Although pyrotechnic weapons were likely used in India years prior, the emergence of gunpowder weapons marked a turning point, which ultimately would not bode well for the Delhi Sultanate. Whatever gunpowder weapons the Sayyids may have had were not enough to stop their dynasty from falling to the final Delhi dynasty, the Lodi dynasty. The Lodis were named for the patriarch of the dynasty, Bahlul Lodi, who swept into northern India from Afghanistan at the head of an army, just as Aibak had done centuries earlier. The sultans of the dynasty never strayed far from their Afghan roots, which is apparent in the dynasty being named after the tribe of which Bahlul and the other sultans were members. The Lodi sultans were forced to deal with a geopolitical situation that was tied to emerging technologies, such as gunpowder weapons, in a world that was very different from the one that existed at the beginning of the Delhi Sultanate. There is some evidence that the Lodi sultans attempted to adapt the new geopolitical reality. A painting from the reign of the Sultan Sikandar Lodi depicts the monarch with a cannon, suggesting that they tried to harness the new technology to keep their hold over Delhi. But it was too little too late. The last Delhi Sultan was Ibrahim, who faced the onslaught of the Mughal forces in the north. As the Mughals took land in the northwest, the Delhi Sultan made one last stand about 70 miles north of Delhi in the town of Panipat. The Mughal Sultan Babur was victorious, toppling the Lodi dynasty in the process and establishing the Mughal dynasty. Babur kept Delhi as the new capital of the Mughal Empire, but Akbar later moved the capital to Sikri. You've been listening to The Delhi Sultanate, the history and legacy of the medieval Islamic dynasty in India by Charles River Editors.